Hello and welcome to our usual Small Game Sunday, but excitingly a double bumper episode. I'm not only doing this because I missed last week. No, not at all, I do it for the love of the video games. Today we have a small puzzle game, one button platformer, the horrors that lurk at the deep of the bottom of a ball pit, pinball-ish game, and a Zelda-like over-the-top fighty fight game. Yes, I know how to use my words well. Our first game for today is Lab for Rat-tional thinking. Yes, I'm going to leave that struggle in there because the name is hard to say. It's a small puzzle game created using an unusual method. It's called The Exquisite Corpse, a niche offshoot of surrealist thought in the 1920s. Do you remember that game where you fold a piece of paper and each person takes turns drawing the next part without being able to see the previous person's drawing, in the end unveiling some weird monstrosity? A method that's both a fun thought experiment in collaborative creation, but also interesting when applied to making other forms of art. I need to look into this a bit further, really, to get a proper opinion, but just know that this game was made by a group of people who took it and then passed it on to someone else. Each person would then do some polish, create a level, or update a small part of it, and then pass it on again. I think that's something that ends up coming through with this method of making game that maybe is more explicit because this is a puzzle game, is how disconnected it can end up feeling. This may be the first game I've done for this series that it's just not really for me. Or there could be something to the fact that each puzzle is designed by different people, means that they require a different logic to understand it. Think of a puzzle game. They traditionally construct levels where you do something basic, you're taught a basic thing, internalise a solution, and then have to reapply it to increasingly more challenging iterations. More nuances are added with additional mechanics, and the game is just expanded following this underlying logic. But it starts with a lesson, and asks you to intuit how it is expanding on that, how it's adding more and eventually becoming a fluid communication between player and developer. Again, it may be I'm just not particularly good at spatial puzzles, but when the game is asking you to solve complex puzzles without teaching you, well, I struggled. Now, I do think this is a hard thing to ask smaller games, especially ones focused around this design method, but it does create a barrier to entry, and one that is not always present in programming-style spatial games. Opus Magnum got difficult, but I could persevere and understand what I was missing, puzzle it through, and had a set of lessons that I'd already learned that could be reapplied. Lab just kind of misses the onboarding and communication. Although for people really fluent in this style of game, well, give it a shot. I'm not saying it's a bad game. I just think maybe not for me. I do think the style and theming of being in a rat maze is fun, and the actual base for the mechanics seem to be good and could be explored and expanded upon. I could just never quite get these disparate parts to link together. Starcatcher might be a new favourite for me. It's a tiny one-button platforming game that is completable in about 20 minutes or so, and it focuses on, well, collecting a range of stars through a level. Your one button makes your character move when pressed, but then jump on release. This means timing out your jumps in a slightly tricky, unusual way, but becomes natural by the end of the game's lifespan. When you press the button again mid-air, you do a ground pound, dropping you directly down, as well as changing your direction, which is key to navigating the levels. The game appeared to have this Mario Galaxy type gravity, but operated in a much simpler way. When you jump off a platform, that is taken as the point of reference for gravity, until you land and jump again. So if I'm running on the underside of a platform and jump, it will take that gravity is going to pull your character upwards. I think this all works well for what the game is, but sometimes it can be a little tricky when taken with the limited interactions that you actually have with the game. It kind of becomes about manipulating this one button and the gravity at the same time to get to the end. I really do need to make a note to look into one button games more, as the premise seems like something that seems so extremely limited. But then you play Starcatcher and you can see how these narrow limitations can be a real creative space to build games out of. They can even have a lot more depth than you think they might. It also seems especially appropriate for game jams, as I do not think this is something that could be sustained inside a commercial game. Well, at least the really big ones. You're not going to get 60 hours of a one button game, I don't think. Well, maybe a clicker. Now, our next game, The Ball Pit, is of course of interest to me because all games are interesting in some way or another. But I digress. It takes the horrors and imagination that lurks in the child's mind, the ability to see a situation and blow it out to its worst proportions, either that or I was just an anxious child, and places its focus on a ball pit. Like, remember how so much of the world was unknown to you, so you didn't have a baseline of understanding and experience to work with? So you can just imagine entire worlds as existing outside of this mundane reality. This is turning into some light therapy. Now, apply all this to a ball pit. And when you do get into this ball pit, you realise that the game's conception of this is a horror, but quite a funny horror game. It uses those semi-dodgy, yet still highly expressive graphics that you see in something like Cruelty Squad to create a world beneath the balls. This sort of aggressive art style is really effective at creating horror. It builds an uneasy feeling as you play through, having little frame of reference for what you're experiencing and what you can expect. Sort of like the thing with the kid earlier. But I also think the game understands that horror and comedy are often flip sides of the same style. Think of how Jordan Peele went from writing sketch comedy to horror films. The building of tension, escalation on the premise, and then the punchline basically has the same form between the two of them. This game plays with this in really interesting ways, using off-kilter environments and freaky enemies that are also by nature kind of satirical and fun. And I think blending this with a child's take of imagining a horror game underneath the ball pit makes it a much more deep game than it might appear on the surface. Remity is our next game, and it takes its place as very inspired by Zelda category. It also currently just serves as a demo for now, but we've played a couple of these, but I want to talk about it in a bit more depth. The reason being is I think that these small projects, or what could be considered just a demo for larger things, are worth considering on their own as separate entities, or at least holistic entities. This is because small teams take a while to build these things, and seeing even a chunk of it can tell us a lot. You can still get a decent play experience out of 30 minutes, you can still see something new and interesting. Just because the game is titled a demo, this is really not any different from Starcatcher. But yeah, Zelda. If I was thinking of a list of cornerstone games, key games for the world of games, it would have to be one. Being so a part of the collective memory of gaming in so many ways, it's obvious why this is a choice of the canvas that artists come back to try and paint their own version. And this isn't me just being derisive. Many huge and important games come from this method of inspiration, and often small changes to the formula can make something that's completely unique and worth it. Remity, for instance, takes a lot more of a Soulsian approach to the genre, with the combat being the main obstacle for progression rather than spatial traversal or item-based puzzling that is the hallmark of Zelda. And with the dodge button being so central for crossing gaps in platforms as well as getting the heck away from enemies, slickly dodging around the screen is key to getting through the game. Hyperlight Drifter also comes to mind when playing this game, and it becomes amazing to see how close Remity gets, considering it's not had the years of polish. The second boss on the first try seemed like it could almost be frustrating, but each subsequent go had me learning a little more, getting some little tricks to beating it, and finally that rush of success after. It's managing to punch above its weight category in so many ways. One little side note that I think is worth talking about, but I have formatted this terribly so I'm just going to do it now, is how the health system works in the vast majority of the rooms. Means that when you take damage you just start over again, which I actually really like. The game becomes about beating one challenge at a time, similar to something like Celeste. But when you do get to that boss you get 3 hits in you, meaning you've got a little more staying power but not enough just to tank everything. This designer really has the capacity to make interesting and tough bosses and enemies. So it would be interesting to see if this game does actually get a full release and progression, but for now, it's a great little chunk of game to play and see how you can make these like smaller individual combat, top-down fighting games, not fighting games, but you know what I mean, Zelda games interesting or well constructed. Our last game for this bumper episode is POE. POE is great. Comes from a similar design ethos to the one button game, although I do not think it counts because it's kind of mouse driven. You have to grab a small cat, who I will assume his name is POE, and fling them directly at enemies in a pinballish manner. POE will then bound around the room, doing damage to each enemy when coming into contact. Below the enemies are little timers that once they reach the bottom they will do an action, so you want to kind of like focus on those before they start attacking you by flinging themselves at you or releasing a projectile. You just have to keep hurling your little kitty to clear out the rooms. Oh, and there's money, meaning that you can buy yourself a heal. just to keep going through the game. I think my only critique to it is the fidelity of launching your cat, which is not a sentence I woke up this morning thinking I was going to say, is stuck to the 8 cardinal directions, meaning that sometimes there's certain throws and chucks that lack the specificity to be able to really line up and feel like you're having loads of control. That being said, it's still just really fun to hurl this cat around. Right, that brings us to the actual end of the episode. I think once I've played for a few more weeks, maybe something like around the Christmas time, I want to do a little wrap up and have a think about the types of games I've played, and to see if we can start to draw out some thoughts and conclusions about the state of small games at the moment. This will be a continuously evolving thing, of course, but looking back at what's been covered at this stage still might tell us something about this particular corner of games. As always, any suggestions, give me a shout in the comments, drop me a like and subscribe for support. My name's been Billy. Peace.